Let's talk about what happens to your brain when you feel like you just don't have enough. Enough time, enough money, enough of anything. We're going to dive into the hidden psychology of how having too little fundamentally changes the way our minds work, the decisions we make, and maybe even who we are.
This quote, it's pretty heavy, right? It comes from a volunteer in this landmark study back in 1944. Healthy men volunteered to be systematically starved so scientists could understand the effects of famine. And what they found, besides the obvious physical stuff, was that the sheer scarcity of food completely took over their minds. They got obsessed. They couldn't think about anything else.
And that story, from way back then, it really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. What is it about scarcity that has this incredible power over us? It's not just about feeling stressed or unhappy. It's a deep, fundamental shift in how our brains are wired to operate.
So to really get this, we've got to first knock down a very common, and it turns out, very wrong idea about why people in tough situations sometimes make decisions that just don't seem to make sense from the outside.
You've probably heard this a million times, right? The idea that people are poor because they make bad decisions. That it all comes down to personal failings, a lack of willpower, maybe not being able to see the big picture. But what if the science shows us that's completely backward?
All right, so let's zoom in on the brain under pressure, in the moment. Scientists have some really clever ways to measure how our decision-making changes when we're hit with acute short-term stress. And the results, well, they're pretty eye-opening.
So, our brains have this built-in quirk called the reflection effect. It sounds a little academic, but all it really means is that we act one way when we think we can gain something, and a totally different way when we're about to lose something. So what happens when you pour a ton of stress on top of that?
And here's the wild part. Stress doesn't just change us. It's like it turns the volume way up on our existing biases. If there's a chance to win something, to gain, stress makes us double down on caution. We get super conservative. But if we're facing a loss, that same stress makes us go all in, taking massive risks to try and claw our way out.
This is what researchers call the desperation threshold. You can think of it like a tripwire in your mind. The moment your resources dip below that critical point, your brain's survival programming just takes over. The logic completely flips from, I gotta protect what I have, to, I have to risk everything just to get back to being okay.
Okay, so that's the short-term shock. But what about that constant, day in, day out pressure of not having enough? This brings us to a really big idea, something called the bandwidth tax.
The idea is so simple, but it's a total game changer. The constant worrying, the mental juggling, the planning you have to do when resources are tight, it acts like a literal tax on your mental bandwidth. It's just like running way too many apps on your phone or your computer. Everything just starts to slow down. You're not any less smart, you just have less of your brain power available to use on anything else.
And listen, this isn't just some abstract theory. Researchers found the perfect real-world test for this idea with sugarcane farmers in India. See, these farmers have this really unique cycle. They're pretty cash poor for most of the year while the cane is growing, but then, right after the harvest, they get paid for the whole year at once.
And the results were just wow. The very same farmers did so much worse on brain tests right before the harvest, when money was the tightest, compared to right after, when they were flush with cash. The only thing that changed was their financial situation. So poverty itself was imposing this huge cognitive load.
So just how big of a load are we talking about here? Well, in another study, researchers gave people a hypothetical problem to think about. And that led to this number.
14. That's the number of IQ points that dropped for lower-income people who were simply asked to think about how they'd cover a surprise $3,000 car repair. I mean, that is a massive cognitive hit. It's actually worse than the mental impairment you get from pulling an all-nighter and not sleeping for a full 24 hours.
The Nobel Prize-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman really just nails the whole shift this research represents. It flips that old assumption completely on its head. It's not that bad decisions make people poor. It's that the condition of being poor is what causes bad decisions. And it gets even deeper. The impact doesn't just stop with the choices you make on a Tuesday. The evidence now suggests that chronic, long-term stress can actually start to reshape something we think of as permanent, our personality.
Check this out. A massive 9-year study in Australia followed people who were dealing with long-term job insecurity. And what they found shows this slow, corrosive effect of chronic stress. Over those years, people actually became more neurotic, so more anxious and prone to negative feelings, and they became less agreeable and less conscientious. The constant stress was literally changing who they were.
So, if we know that scarcity drains our bandwidth and can even change our personality, how are we supposed to think about solving the problems that come with it? Well, this leads to a fantastic analogy that just reframes the whole issue.
Okay, picture this. It's World War II. The US military has this huge, baffling problem. They're seeing a sudden spike in pilots crashing planes on landing because they're pulling up the landing gear instead of the wing flaps. The first reaction, of course, was to blame the pilots. They must be careless, right? Or exhausted.
But then, someone took a closer look and realized the true culprit. In those two specific models of planes, the lever for the landing gear and the lever for the flaps looked exactly the same, and they were right next to each other. Under the stress of landing, it was an incredibly easy mistake to make. It wasn't pilot error, it was a cockpit design problem.
And that analogy gives us two completely different ways to look at just about any problem. The pilot view says we need to fix the individual, give them more training, more motivation. But the cockpit view asks a different question. Is the system itself, the environment, the rules, the pressures, is it designed in a way that sets people up to fail?
So when we look at something like a payday loan store through that lens, the question completely changes. For someone whose bandwidth is completely gone, someone who's past that desperation threshold, is this a lifeline, or is it a perfectly designed instrument in a financial cockpit that's built to take advantage of a mind that's already under siege?
Do you see how powerful that shift is? It moves us away from blaming people for having limited bandwidth, and it gets us asking, how can we design systems that demand less of it? How do we build things that work with our brains, not against them?
And that, really, is the challenge this all leaves us with. If we accept that our mental bandwidth is this finite, precious resource, and we know that stress and scarcity drain it, then the goal can't be to just tell people to try harder. The real important question becomes, how can we build better cockpits? How do we design policies and programs and systems that are more forgiving of the human mind under pressure and create a little more room for the errors we all inevitably make?